I have a picture I want to show you. I saw a headline recently that said this. It said, "My church is closing, and I don't know what comes next." And it told the story of the First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, Illinois. It was founded in 1868, and at one time had been a thriving congregation in a town of about 14,000. According to some of the longtime members, the 1960s and 70s were kind of the church's heyday. In fact, in the 1960s, they grew so large that they had to build a 14,000 square foot addition just to make room for all the people that were coming. It continued on like that through the 70s, but at some point during the 80s, something shifted, and the church entered into a long period of steady decline. That continued up and through the 90s, and fast forward to 2006, that's when they hired the guy you see on the screen, Dr. Ryan Burge, to be their minister, kind of a young guy. And unfortunately, despite his best efforts, the church just continued to decline. He described it to a reporter from the New York Times saying this. He said, "For a couple of years, we would have 24 people on a good Sunday, but every 6 or 8 months, we would lose a key member, then another, and then another. Then 24 became 15, then 12, then 10. As attendance dwindled, so did our bank account." He then added this. He said, "I've heard people say that organizations die slowly, then all at once." And that's what happened to us. At some point during his ministry, things got so bad that they stopped meeting in the sanctuary and they started meeting in what had once been a Sunday school room with just about 8 or 10 of them. It got so bad that finally on July 21st, 2024, just last year, they held their final service. I've got a picture of the 20 or so people that showed up. After the service was over, they turned out the lights and they locked the door and they left for the last time. Now, unfortunately, that's a story that gets reenacted multiple times every week. Researchers tell us that on the average Sunday, 135 churches in America have their last service. What makes the story of First Baptist Church in Mount Vernon, Illinois so interesting, though, is that in addition to being their preacher for the last 18 years, Ryan Burge is also a sociologist and has become sort of the most often cited researcher on church growth in America. You see him on CNN, you see him on Fox News, you see him on all the news channels. He has a huge social media following. Almost every day he puts up some chart that explains where we are and how we got here. A couple of years ago he wrote a great book titled The Great De-Churching that talked about why so many churches are struggling and what it might take to inject new life into them. In a recent interview, Dr. Burge noted the irony of being seen as America's foremost church growth expert while leading the only church he ever led to closing. But he made this comment that he didn't think his experience was all that atypical in today's climate. And what he meant by that is that in some places there is this unspoken assumption that the best the church can hope for is just to hang on as long as we can until it dwindles away to nothing and there's just a few people left and somebody closes the door and locks the door for the last time. And that's the assumption that a lot of churches operate under, whether it's articulated or not. But what if it could be better than that? What if there was a way for a local church not just to wither away, but to actually impact its community in profound ways for generations to come? If you have your Bible, I want you to open up to Luke chapter 10. This morning we're in week 2 of this series in which we're talking about how we can become the kind of church that really does impact its community for multiple generations. And in Luke 10, what you find is a passage that helps explain how to do this. But to understand what's happening in Luke 10, you have to understand just a little bit about Luke chapter 9. So at the beginning of Luke chapter 9, Jesus calls together his 12 disciples, these guys who have been with him since the beginning, and he sends them out on what we would call a mission trip. He wants them to go out in new places and do what they've seen him doing. So he sends them out on this mission trip. You get down to verse 51 of Luke chapter 9, and it says that Jesus has now turned his attention toward Jerusalem, which means he's going to leave where he is. He's going to head towards Jerusalem for what he knows will be one final showdown with his enemies. But before he embarks on his journey toward Jerusalem, he calls together a larger group of people. And this is where you pick up the story in Luke 10. A larger group of people of 72 people. Your translation may say 70. Don't worry too much about that. But he calls this larger group, and he too sends them out on a mission trip. So it's essentially a repeat of what he'd done with his disciples earlier. And he says, I want you guys to go out ahead of me. I want you to visit all these little towns, all these little villages, and I want you to tell them about me and prepare the way for me. So in Luke chapter 9, he starts with the leaders, these guys who have been there since the beginning. In Luke chapter 10, he expands it to include a much larger group of people, these 72 people that he will send ahead of him. Now, here's why this is important. Whose mission is it to advance the kingdom and share the gospel? Now, if you only had Luke chapter 9, like you could do what a lot of us do, and you could say, hey, it's obviously the job of the leaders of the church, right? So it's the preacher and maybe the staff, and maybe you can include the elders in that, but it's their job. And like if you're the leader, it's your job to advance the mission. If you only had Luke chapter 9, like maybe you could draw that conclusion. But when you get to Luke chapter 10, you realize that it's not just the leaders, it's not just the 12 disciples, it's everybody. It's this huge group of 72 people. Like 72 people, like that's a church, right? So what Luke is telling us through this chapter, the way he organized this, is that it's not just my job, and it's not just like their job, it's our job. It's everybody's job who considers themselves a part of the family, everybody who's been adopted into God's family. It's your job and it's our job to advance the kingdom. And so in Luke chapter 10, Luke shows us how to do this. Verse 1 says, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others, and he sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. He told them, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a purse or bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. I want you to go back to verse 1 where it says, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others. It's a word that means this was not just like a suggestion. This was more like a formal commissioning. There was some specific mission that he assigned to these 72 people. And so the question is, what is that mission? And it's the same as it is today. It's connecting lost people to Jesus. That was their mission. That's our mission. Later in Luke 19:10, Jesus made it clear that his mission has always been about reaching lost people when he said, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Now, as his followers in 2025, that should be the lens through which we view every decision. The main question we always ask should be, how does this help us connect with lost people and connect lost people to Jesus? Now, unfortunately, in churches, we have a tendency to mess this up. Most of the time, the main question in churches becomes something like this, is how can we keep everybody who's already a part of the church happy? Or how can we better connect with church people? And the reality is that's what we're most comfortable with, especially if you grew up going to church. Like, you're most comfortable with other people who are like you. And so most churches won't take the risk of asking the question, what can we do to reach people who are not like us? And so we get obsessed with asking the wrong question, and because of that, we get the wrong answer. But here's what you have to understand. That's not up to us. This is not our decision to make. The decision has already been made, and Jesus made it clear that his primary thing that he wanted his people to do was connect with lost people and connect them to him. And so what's our strategy for doing this? It's very simple. It's each one, reach one. This passage says that Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. Last week we looked at kind of this idea of these one-on-one groups, and it doesn't matter how you do it. The point is that you do it. Go back to verse 2. It says, Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Now, that's a phrase pops up several times throughout the New Testament in which Jesus compares the potential size of the harvest with the ongoing lack of workers. He does it over and over again. So the question then is, who are these workers and why aren't they working? And the answer is that the workers, us. That's why you get to verse 3. Jesus said, go, sending you. Not sending them, not sending some other people. I'm sending you. Now here's my question. What if all of us did that? What if instead of just a handful of people working to advance the kingdom, all of us decided that we're going to make this our mission? What if we had an army of people who just said, you know what, of all the other things I'm involved in, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend my life connecting with lost people and trying to reach lost people. What kind of connection, what kind of impact do you think we could have on our community? So as you continue this passage, you get to verse 3. And from the end of verse 3 down until verse 16, Jesus calls this group together and he gives them a pep talk. It's like, here's what you need to know before you launch out into this journey, this mission trip that you're about to take. And so he goes through and he highlights several things. And initially, what's so interesting about this is he highlights the importance of building relationships with the people that you're trying to reach. So you can see this in verse 5. He says like this: when you enter a house, first say, peace to this house. If someone who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you. Stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. And then he adds kind of this parenthetical comment. He says, do not move around from house to house. What is he talking about? He's talking about the importance of building relationships with the people. And so he says to them, as you guys go out on this mission trip, the success of your trip will be determined by how well you do connecting with the people who live in the towns that you're getting ready to visit. So he says, don't move around from house to house. Just settle down, put down roots, and start to get to know the people. Now, for us, it looks different. For us, rather than going out and initiating new relationships, our job is to leverage the relationships we already have with the people we already know. So last week, I saw an article from the Wall Street Journal. You may have seen this, in which a sociologist from the University of Washington has discovered or now claims that the average person knows 611 people. I thought that's kind of a precise number, but he says if you do the research, the average person will know 611 people by name. So if you saw them, like, you would know their name. Now, I know, like, you may have more Facebook friends than that and all that, but apparently there's people you don't know. But even with that, even if that's true, 611 is a lot of people. The real number, at least according to sociologists, is what's called Dunbar's number. You may have never heard of this. It says that the average person can only maintain 150 ongoing relationships. If you think about it, that means if you put a piece of paper, I'm gonna put this on the screen just so you can see it. If you put a piece of paper and you tried to list everybody that you interact with on a normal basis. These are people like you see them at work, you see them at church. Maybe we don't have it on the screen, but anyway, I did initially. Or I thought I did. So you make a list, right? You got everybody lives in your neighborhood, the people you work with, people you go to church with, people your kids hang out with their kids and all that stuff. If you made a list of people that you talk to on a regular basis, it would probably be about 150 people. Now here's my question. How many of those people are lost? Probably more than you think. And who would be in a better position to reach those people than you? Like, you think about it like this. If you just pull out your phone, and you don't have to, I mean, I guess you can, but you don't have to, and go through your recent text messages, and you look at your favorite contacts, the people that you talk to the most, how many of those people are lost? I bet there's more than you think. And it's very possible that you might be the person that's in the position to reach those people. And so how do you do this? Jesus mentions three things in this passage. If you're tracking with us, the first thing is, as you attempt to reach your community, you have to communicate the gospel simply. Look at verse 8. This is so good. He said, when you enter a town and are welcomed, eat what is offered to you, heal the sick who are there, and tell them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. But when you enter a town and are not welcomed, go into its streets and say, even the dust of your town we wipe from our feet as a warning to you. Yet be sure of this, the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, it will be more bearable on that day for Sodom than for that town. So I got a picture. I hope this is here. I saw this just a few weeks ago. This is the entrance to a store. Now, have you ever seen something like that? You walk up against that and you're not sure exactly what you're supposed to do, right? Like, it says to come in, and it also says to stay out. And so you're kind of confused. And unfortunately, that kind of deal right there, that front door could be the front door to a lot of churches. And here's what I mean by that. In churches, we have this tendency, we love to talk about how everybody's welcome, right? And we want everybody to come. At the same time, we communicate these mixed messages. And we have these subtle ways of communicating, like, yes, everybody's welcome, as long as you look like us and think like us and vote like us and like what we like and just try to be like us. And as long as you're like us, then you're welcome to come in. But if you're not like us, or if you're not enough like us, then you should probably just stay out. In churches, like we're experts at focusing on the wrong stuff, at communicating mixed messages, at getting obsessed over like secondary issues at the expense of the primary thing. But when you look at what Jesus communicated to these people right before they go out on this mission, he's only got one message. It's kind of a one-point sermon. And just so they don't miss it, he says it twice. You see it in verse 9 and again in verse 11 where he says, the kingdom of God has come near. That's the message. That's what he wants people to know. It's not all the other stuff. It's not the thousands of secondary issues. And the implication, of course, is that because the kingdom of God has come near, it's changed everything. So the present is different. The future is going to be different, all because God has now arrived on the scene in the form of Jesus Christ. I like the way Tim Keller explained this when he wrote, suppose a king goes out to defend his lands from an invading army. If the king is defeated by the enemy, he sends back military advisors to advise the people on how to shore up their city's defenses and save themselves. But if the king defeats the invading army, he sends back messengers with the news, we have defeated the enemy, rejoice and live in that victory. And he goes on, he says this, now apply that to religion. Every other religion sends military advisors to put in place rites, rituals, and laws so fearful people can try and save themselves. Christianity sends messengers to say, Jesus has won. Rejoice and live in the light of that victory. Here's my question. How much more effective would we be if that's what we talked about? How much more effective would we be if instead of obsessing over all the secondary issues, we had one primary mission that we communicated as simply and as lovingly as possible? How much more do you think people would be willing to listen if we just told them what Jesus told us to tell them? Here's the second thing you see. As you do this, you also have to remember the consequences. You get down to verse 13. Here's what it says. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon at the judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted up to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. So by the time you get to Luke 10, Jesus is now in the last 6 months of his 3-year ministry. And so by this point, he's already been to all these places. He's already traveled through all these towns. And the implication is that just like today, there were certain communities that were more receptive to the gospel than others. And he even names some of these. And he says, you guys, it would have been better for the people living in these communities that rejected him to have been citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah than to reject him. And you say, why would he include that? Like, why is he talking about that? Remember, this is part of this pep talk. He's trying to impress upon these 72 people that as they go out to all these little towns and as they do their best to share the message with the people who live in these little towns, that this really matters. Like, there will be consequences to how people respond to the gospel. He's trying to build a sense of urgency. He wants them to know, like, this is not a hobby. This is not something that you do when there's nothing else to do. This is not something you only do when you feel like. This is not just a matter of life and death. This is a matter of eternity. And there will be eternal consequences for people that you know, depending on how they respond to the message of the gospel. So I saw an article this past week that said the response time for an ambulance in Kentucky is a full minute longer than most of the states around us. And you think, well, that doesn't seem like that's a big deal. It's 9.7 minutes in Kentucky. It's 8.7 minutes in the states around us. And with all the rural areas, you can understand why it's true. But because of that, there are certain areas in Kentucky, certain counties, that are doing upgrades in an attempt to get that number down, right? And so Daviess County, which is over in Owensboro, recently did this, multi-million-dollar upgrade to their 911 system, and they said the results of that has been, over the last year, it's cut 40 seconds off the average response time for an ambulance. And hear that, and you say, I'm not sure, like a multi-million-dollar deal to cut 40 seconds off is a wise investment. But if you're having a heart attack, or you're in a car wreck, or one of your kids is choking, like 40 seconds, big deal. Might be the difference between life and death. And so you hear that, the first responders know, like they know, their job is to get there as fast as they can so they can save as many as they can. They live with a sense of urgency. There's my question. When's the last time you felt any urgency at all for sharing the message with somebody? It's not just going to impact their life, but their eternity. When's the last time you thought, if I don't go talk to that person as soon as I can, it may be too late. And I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not trying to, lay a guilt trip on you. I'm just telling you, that's what Jesus said. And then to make sure we don't miss the point, he says it even more explicitly in verse 16 when he kind of ends the pep talk. He says, whoever listens to you listens to me. And whoever rejects you rejects me. But whoever rejects me rejects him who sent me. To make sure you don't rush past that. Jesus says, whoever listens to you, like as messed up and as imperfect as you are, listens to him. And whoever rejects you rejects him and also rejects the one who sent him, which is the Father. So what is Jesus' strategy for reaching lost people? It's you. It's you and it's me. And you might hear that and you think, man, I'm not sure that's the strategy I would have chosen. And I probably wouldn't have chosen it either. I mean, if we were to bring a whiteboard in, we could brainstorm for the next 15 minutes. We could come up with a whole lot of ways that we think might be more effective in reaching lost people than us. But again, that's not our decision. Our job is not to sit back and debate the game plan. Our job is to execute the strategy that's already been determined. And if we don't do it, Jesus says, it won't get done. So that brings us to the last thing. It's so important. He says, as you're executing the strategy, remember to celebrate the ultimate victory. So this passage is kind of tricky. You get to verse 16, there is an unspecified gap between verse 16 and verse 17. We don't know how long it was, maybe a couple months, maybe more than that. But all we know is this group of 72, they go out to these places, they do what Jesus told them to do, and now when you get to verse 17, it says they've returned. And here's what it says. The 72 returned with joy, and they said, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. He replied, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I've given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. But then there's this warning in verse 20. He says, however, do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. And this must have been an incredible experience. They come back and people have listened to them. They've seen people healed. They've seen demons cast out. And they're high-fiving one another. They're patting each other on their back. Everybody's telling this story. Hey, let me tell you what I saw, and let me tell you about this thing that I did. And it must be this incredible celebration. And then right in the middle of the party, Jesus says, you guys really did a great job. Like you, through your efforts, man, you struck a significant blow against Satan. Like I saw Satan fall from heaven. It's this cool thing. But then he shifts tones just a little bit, and he warns them, and he reminds them of something to make sure that as you're celebrating, like as you're high-fiving each other, just make sure that you're celebrating the right thing. You ever noticed how in churches we sometimes celebrate less important things, and we neglect to celebrate the most important thing? Like if you grew up in church, you know how it goes. Attendance goes up, some new ministry gets started, some new building gets built, some big purchase gets made that everybody's excited about, and we high-five each other, and we clap. And I'm not saying those things are not important. Sometimes they're really important if they help you fulfill your mission. But Jesus said the most important thing, the thing that's always of first importance, is that you make sure that your name and the names of the people you love are written in heaven. If you get that right, all that other stuff takes care of itself. So in the ancient world, every city kept a list, an up-to-date list of the people who lived in that city. They called it a census. And the only people who were listed on the census were like legal citizens, people who were legally citizens. And so the picture that Jesus paints, and you see this again in Revelation, is that there is this census list in heaven. The Revelation calls it the Lamb's Book of Life. And every single person who's been adopted into God's family, their name is written in that book. And so he says, as you're celebrating, if your name is in that book, then you're good to go. Like you have a good time, celebrate everything around you. But if your name is not written in that book, then it doesn't matter what else is going on around you. If your name's not on that census list, it's all going to come to nothing. And so the most important thing for any church, the most important thing for any follower of Jesus is to make sure that we're helping people have their names written in that book. C.S. Lewis said it like this: the church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christ. If they are not doing that, then all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. God became man for no other purpose. I told you last week that according to the Census Bureau, the population of Wayne County this year is 19,580, of which it's estimated there's 17,500 that don't go to church anywhere. Now here's my question. How long do you think it would take if we all got serious about this? If we all say, hey, over the next year, we're all just going to reach one person. I'm not asking you to reach everybody, just one person. How long do you think it would take to win everybody in our county to the kingdom? I think it would take 5 years. I'll show you. I'm going to put this up. You can see the math. If everybody just said, you know what, each one is going to reach one, and the next year each one's going to reach one, and you can just see how the math works out. It would take a little more than 5 years, and everybody in our county would be a Christian. Now, here's what happens whenever you show something like this. There's some of you are thinking, you're skeptical, right? And you're thinking of all the reasons this could never happen. Let me ask you something. Do you think maybe the reason it's never happened before is because nobody's tried it? You think it's possible? The reason there are so many people in our community that are lost is because nobody's talked to them. George Bernard Shaw, the great writer, said, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. Others dream things that never were. They ask why not. Why couldn't it happen?" Jesus said it like this in John 20, verse 21. He said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending." Not them, not those people, but you. What's God's strategy for reaching lost people? It's using imperfect people like us to leverage our relationships with the people who are already in our circles so that we can communicate the gospel clearly while remembering that there will be consequences for those who reject. So as the band comes, I've got another picture I want to show you. In one of the articles about the closing of the First Baptist in Mount Vernon, Illinois, they talked about some of the practical realities you run into whenever you're trying to close a church. For example, what do you do with 300 hymnals, right? And who wants 40-year-old choir robes? And what do you do with membership certificates, that are over 100 years old? What do you do with all? Those are the kind of questions that no local church ever wants to confront, and yet those are the questions that they've been working through over the last couple of years. So I was reading this article, though. There was something that was said in the last paragraph that I thought was significant. It kind of sent me down this rabbit hole, and I just want to read it to you. Here's what it said. This is the article about them. It says, "The decline of First Baptist followed a larger pattern among churches in the United States. That pattern is played out in Mount Vernon, where small churches like First Baptist have struggled. First Presbyterian Church, for example, shares space with a local Lutheran congregation, while its former building is now a YMCA." And then, so you kind of get the picture. And then there's this one line I thought was so interesting. Here's what it says. "Meanwhile, about a mile south of First Baptist, Central Christian, a non-denominational multi-site congregation, is thriving." And so it kind of sent me down the rabbit hole, and I took a screenshot. I got another picture. This is a screenshot of the Friday night worship service at Central Christian. Now, if it looks like that on Friday night, you can imagine what it looks like on Sundays. So I was looking, and it turns out that the church right down the road from this church that closed is a part of the same movement that we're a part of, and it dates back to 1858. So it really is a tale of two churches. You have two historic churches within a mile of each other. One is now closed, while the other continues to impact its community and is set up to impact its community for generations to come. About the same time they started, basically the same beliefs. One is now closed. One continues to impact its community. So the question for us is, which one are we going to be? Are we going to try to hold on, just make it happen till nobody's left and the last person turns off the lights? Or are we going to be the kind of church we're going to do whatever it takes? We're going to talk to whoever we need to talk to reach people with the gospel. See, the mission's clear. There's no debate about that. The only question is whether or not we, us, are going to communicate and execute the strategy. So I want you to stand with me, and we're going to close today, as we always do, with a couple songs. And I want to give you just a clear invite. If you're here and you say, "I want to be a part of this, and I wanted to make this my church home," we'd love to have you do that. We had a great family do that last weekend. If you're already a baptized believer, we'd love to have you join the team. Just keep in mind that God's strategy is for God's people to share the message of God's love. That's our strategy. That's our goal. That's what we've been called to do. And if you'd like to be a part of that, we'd love to have you, because just so you know, there is no plan B. Like, it's either us or it doesn't get done. Others of you may be here, and maybe as I was talking about your name being written in heaven, you're not sure it's there. And so if you're not, David's here, I'm here. We'd love to talk with you. We'd love to pray with you. We'll do anything we can to help you experience that even today. So if you need to make a decision, if you need to pray with somebody, we'd be glad to talk.